History as it happens, February 4th, 2021. Impeachment again.
I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
Indeed, I did have a relationship with Ms. Lewinsky that was not appropriate. In fact, it was wrong.
This was a fraudulent election, but we can't play into the hands of these people. We have to have peace.
Impeachment's been a sword of Damocles hanging over the head of many a modern president, from Nixon to Clinton to Trump twice. Is impeachment broken, or is the problem polarized politics and partisan media? Let's talk about what's changed since Watergate as we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
I had no prior knowledge of the Watergate break-in. I neither took part in nor knew about any of the subsequent cover-up activities.
I did not have sexual relations with that woman, Ms. Lewinsky.
He's lying about the President of the United States and as to what the President says. You know, I believe it or not, I watch my words very carefully. There are those that think I'm a very stable genius, okay?
Hello, everyone. Here we are. What's supposed to be a historic event, the fourth impeachment trial of an American president. Yet it feels rather anticlimactic, doesn't it? The issues are, of course, critical to our democracy. The arguments each side will make in the trial will matter, even if the outcome is a foregone conclusion. We're here because Donald Trump spent months trying to overturn an election.
All I want to do is this. I just want to find 11,780 votes, which is one more than we have, because we won the state, and flipping the state is a great testament to our country, because, you know, and there's just, it's a testament that they can admit to a mistake, or whatever you want to call it, if it was a mistake. I don't know.
Mr. President, you have people that submit information, and we have our people that submit information, and then it comes before the court, and the court then has to make a determination. We have to stand by our numbers. We believe our numbers are right.
Well, why do you say that, though?
Mr. President, the problem you have with social media, people can say anything.
No, this isn't social media. This is Trump media.
Well, after that phone call to Georgia election officials didn't work, after dozens of legal challenges failed too, Trump attended a rally January 6th. A mob of his supporters assaulted the Capitol building after that, and now he'll stand trial in the Senate on charges he incited the mob. In a moment, we'll speak to Washington Times reporter Dave Boyer about what to expect in the Senate. Spoiler alert, acquittal. You know, the impeachment dramas of the past shared some things in common. They usually started with a very public denial and were followed by public humiliation once the lies were exposed months or even years later. Remember, Watergate dragged on for more than 2 years.
In all of my years of public life, I have never obstructed justice. And I think, too, that I can say that in my years of public life, that I welcome this kind of examination, because people have got to know whether or not their president is a crook. Well, I'm not a crook. Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president at that hour in this office.
I want you to listen to me. I'm going to say this again. I did not have sexual relations with that woman, Miss Lewinsky. I never told anybody to lie, not a single time, never. These allegations are false, and I need to go back to work for the American people. Thank you. Indeed, I did have a relationship with Miss Lewinsky that was not appropriate. In fact, it was wrong. It constituted a critical lapse in judgment and a personal failure on my part for which I am solely and completely responsible.
We're also going to talk about what's different between then and now. In both Trump impeachments, compared to Nixon and Clinton, much of the evidence was disclosed almost immediately. The facts of the case assembled fairly quickly. Quick recap, in August 2019, a whistleblower filed a complaint about the Trump administration's pressure campaign against Ukraine and its new president. Just 1 month later, President Trump released the rough transcript of his call with Ukraine's president.
Because the phone call was perfect.
He was impeached by mid-December, acquitted in the Senate less than 2 months later.
Much of the media in this country is not just fake, it's corrupt.
In a fairly short amount of time, a detailed timeline of the Ukraine pressure campaign was compiled. Almost nothing about it remained secret. Same for Trump impeachment number 2, after all the events played out on our TV screens. What's also different, and arguably most important of all in this analysis, is the media landscape today. Depending on which social media feeds you follow or channels you watch, you can subscribe to entirely different interpretations of that same very public evidence that resulted in Trump being impeached twice. More on that angle in a moment. First, we check in with Washington Times Deputy Editor for Politics, Dave Boyer. Dave, let's start with the end. Donald Trump will not be convicted, right?
That's right, Martin. I mean, there's no question. There's 45 Republican senators who were not interested even in holding a trial. Democrats would need at least 17 out of 50 Republicans to vote for Trump's conviction. It's not going to happen.
All right, we'll just wrap up the podcast right now. Was there ever a chance enough Republicans might have been convinced to vote to convict, say, immediately after the mob attack?
I don't think so. It seems like there were about anywhere from 5 to 10 Republican senators who were entertaining that possibility. Mitch McConnell, the Senate Minority Leader, was at one time expressing the possibility of convicting Trump because he wants nothing more to do with Trump.
If he really wants to be rid of Trump, why not try to rally the rank and file, or does he just believe it's a lost cause at this point?
Lost cause, definitely. And also there's the factor that Donald Trump has, roughly 72 million Americans out there who voted for him in November.
All right, Dave, let's look at the other side of the aisle now. Did Democrats believe there was a window of opportunity at some point to convince Republicans to convict Trump?
It seemed to me to be an unreasonable hope, but I think some of them did hope that they could persuade, as all these videos of the attack on the Capitol were emerging and we got to see firsthand really how terrifying it was. They were hoping that the public sentiment would persuade some more Republicans, maybe including some Republican senators who were retiring in 2022. But I think Democrats realize now that's just not going to happen.
Dave Boyer, you'll be a big part of the Washington Times coverage of the trial. How long is it going to last? Will there be witnesses, or is it going to be more of a formality, an up or down vote?
Well, Martin, those are all really good questions. And my answers are don't know, and B and C don't know. They're talking about a trial that would take, I'm sure, less than 2 weeks, but it's really not clear at this point. It's not clear whether they would have any witnesses. There's been speculation that maybe Trump himself would come back from Florida to appear at some point, but I really don't see that happening.
Well, I've thought about whether Trump, the consummate entertainer, would want to come back to Washington and appear in the Senate.
As much as he loves to be the center of attention, and especially in a televised setting, I don't see him putting himself on the block here for what he considers a persecution, a phony, irrelevant persecution. So I don't see that happening. And the concern, I think, in Democratic circles, too, is that the repeat of the January 6th riot might occur. And we've still got thousands of National Guard troops around the Capitol who are waiting until they're going to be here until probably mid-March to make sure that nothing goes wrong before this trial ends.
All right. Thank you, Dave Boyer, for sharing your thoughts here again. Mr. Boyer was working for the Washington Times way back in 1998 when Bill Clinton was impeached. I believe that was before Twitter and Facebook, etc. So let's talk some history and media now with Rutgers University historian David Greenberg, an expert on journalism and media studies. He's the author of Republic of Spin, an inside history of the American presidency. He's also written about Nixon. David, you drafted an open letter signed by more than 1,000 historians and constitutional scholars calling for President Trump to be impeached. The letter stated Trump has defied the Constitution and broken laws, norms, practices, and precedents for which he must be held accountable now and after he leaves office. So let's start with this. Why do you think it's important for historians to weigh in on this, and have you received any criticism for doing so?
Well, I drafted this with a couple other historians, and normally I'm not a petition signer. Various petitions go around to historians and academics fairly often. I also tend to be wary of historians, scholars getting too caught up in politics. It's sometimes hard to know when we are using our judgment as historians and when we're using our judgment as citizens who have political views. And I think it's important to always be mindful of keeping those distinct. In this case, though, after the storming of the Capitol on January 6th and Trump's role in egging that on, you'll notice we didn't use the word incite in the letter because that has a precise legal definition that can be debated. But certainly he did a lot to provoke it, to encourage it, and certainly didn't do much to stop it. And for those reasons, it seemed that he really, even for Trump, who had done a lot that was controversial and worthy of reproach, this crossed yet another line. You know, we talk about what's unprecedented, and that is something that historians can speak to with authority, that what Trump had done here truly was unprecedented. And historians seem to have a role in the debate in vouching for that claim and in making clear this was not something any other president had ever done, and for good reason.
So you chose the words egging on instead of incitement to describe the president's behavior. Some of his defenders have pointed to this audio clip to say he did nothing wrong.
I know that everyone here will soon be marching over to the Capitol building to peacefully and patriotically make your voices heard.
Now, that defense of Trump does ignore the fact that he spent months delegitimizing the election and continues to claim to this day that it was stolen from him.
Right. I mean, context is all important here. And he had said, come on January 6th, it will be wild. He had said fight. He had told them to go and stop the steal. There were a lot of other words that were quite inflammatory. You know, it's traditional that we look at the complete context, that a single word or phrase doesn't necessarily get you off the hook. Now, in a court of law, you would, adjudicate that very finely. I think in the case of impeachment, obviously one wants to see justice served and be faithful to the evidence. But the legal standard for using incitement, for the term incitement, which comes from a, I think, 1969 decision called Brandenburg, is not really what's at issue. What's really at issue is, did the president behave properly in giving that speech in all of his months before encouraging millions of Americans not to accept the outcome of the election? That's really what's at stake. That's the bigger question.
So here we are. Another Senate trial is getting underway, and barring some unforeseen development, it'll end in an acquittal. I'll ask, is impeachment simply broken, or is it that our politics are irredeemable, meaning neither side will ever be willing to remove a president of their own party from power?
Right. As you note, I've written on Nixon, and what's significant about Nixon's resignation, which was done with sort of the specter of impeachment and removal hanging over his head. So although he wasn't impeached, he would have been impeached and would have been removed. So we've come a long way from when the Republican Party was willing to acknowledge such behavior on the part of their own president, their own party leader, and today when very few Republicans are willing to do so.
10 of them voted for impeachment.
Right, exactly. So, it was a significant number given the state of play today, more than we saw in the first impeachment of Trump. And we see maybe a handful of Republican senators have shown a willingness to consider it, but certainly not enough to convict. So, yes, our politics have changed dramatically from 1974. And the obvious variable is this intense partisan loyalty. That is a problem. That's a real problem for our democracy because progress depends on some degree of crossing party lines, of freedom to kind of throw off the duty to party loyalty and think independently.
For most of our country's history, impeachment was rarely used, wasn't even talked about much, really. Andrew Johnson in 1868, and then it doesn't come up again until the 1970s and Richard Nixon. Since then, it's been used a lot more, been threatened a lot more. But to my earlier question, if impeachment is broken, what might be the right remedy?
You know, impeachment is meant to be used very rarely. Ideally, presidents should not succumb to the behavior that would make impeachment warranted. So the fact that it was used so sparingly is really a good thing, is a sign that it was working well. Now, recently, you know, you could throw in the Clinton impeachment. There was talk, never acted upon, of impeaching both Ronald Reagan for Iran-Contra and George Bush on various things about the Iraq War. I think wisely those did not go forward, but we're starting to see it used much more in a partisan fashion. In Trump's case, I think impeachment was both partisan and justified, if that makes sense. But it, I think, is starting to lose some of its value and its sting when it becomes too easy a recourse. So censure, of course, is a possibility. Censure is not spelled out in the Constitution, but is a very simple remedy that perhaps could get a greater degree of bipartisan support if the Senate wanted to pursue that. I think they are probably obligated to pursue an impeachment trial because the House has reported the articles, and that's the Senate's job to carry it out. The saving grace is we do now have a 2-term limit on presidents, and that combined with fixed elections, you know, Americans take this for granted because it's what we know growing up and it's all we've ever practiced. But having fixed elections, knowing that after 4 years we get to vote and vote somebody out, is a very important bulwark of our democratic system. It's not the case in all systems that you have regularly scheduled elections, in all democratic systems, parliamentary systems. So I think those two checks, even if impeachment becomes something of a dead letter or an overly politicized tool, we still know someone like Trump would only be president for 8 years. Now, a bad president could do a lot of damage in 8 years. I don't mean to minimize that, but it's very different from when you hear people talk about fascism and this kind of thing. We have mechanisms in place to prevent fascism or dictatorship here.
As I was preparing my questions for you and framing this episode in my mind, I was trying to do it in a way that wouldn't sound partisan. I know, impossible, right? Because impeachment is by nature political. But then I concluded, we don't look back at 1860 and blame both parties equally for what happened. We're not being partisan by pointing out the Democratic Party was the party of slavery. And we shouldn't look back at 1974 and say Republicans betrayed Nixon by voting for impeachment on the House Judiciary Committee. Instead, we know they did the right thing because Nixon broke the law. So today it happens that Democrats are being partisan in their pursuit of Trump, but they might also be right to impeach him about what he did. And Republicans are being partisan in their defense of Trump and could also be wrong to defend him. How do we get around this problem?
This is a problem of trying to judge the present moment. And as events recede into history, partisan interpretations tend to fall away, as you say, whether it's about the Civil War or even about Watergate, something relatively more recent. And oftentimes a consensus does form about what was right and wrong, what was sound and unsound, wise and unwise. In the current moment, it is much harder to arrive at that kind of consensus, almost by definition. So, we have to then sort of guess. We can't know what history will say about Donald Trump or about the Democrats' desire to impeach him. We can't know for certain. People won't look back and say, the Democrats really didn't need to impeach him a second time. They were just kind of rubbing salt in the wounds. I mean, that's plausible that those interpretations will be handed down decades hence. To me, even as I try to sort of separate my politics from my historical judgment, it does seem very likely that historians in the future will fully understand why Democrats felt compelled to impeach Trump a second time. When we comment on present affairs, we always have to allow for the possibility that future events will change our perspective on things. And history is full of examples of people who thought they held the high road and in retrospect have come to be seen as having made grave mistakes. Prohibition is kind of a classic example.
And, of course, the media, however defined, have an enormous influence on the different realities Americans live in these days. Professor Greenberg, you're also an expert on journalism and media studies, so good segue right here. When the smoking gun Nixon tapes were revealed, they sealed his fate. It proved that Nixon had been lying all along about covering up the Watergate break-in. Let's listen to a short clip. And I'll repeat what Nixon said there because the audio was a little hard to discern. He said, good deal. Play it tough. That's the way they play it. That's the way we're going to play it. He was giving marching orders to H.R. Haldeman after they discussed the break-in and how to cover it up. And when that became known, it was impossible for Nixon to spin his way out of it, right? There was no cable network or online news outlet that could try to gaslight the public and say he actually didn't say what we heard him say. Now, let's listen to Donald Trump from early January, days before the mob attacked Congress, speaking to Georgia election officials on the phone.
I just want to find 11,780 votes, which is one more than we have, because we won the state, and flipping the state is a great testament to our country.
Depending on which TV station you watch or website you visit regularly, you might have a completely different interpretation of that phone call. So why don't you pick it up from there? The entirely different media world we're living in now compared to Nixon's time or even Clinton's time.
Right. It's a very important question, an important development in our culture. The rise of first partisan media. You had with talk radio, even before Fox News came along, and then with Fox and now additional channels. Then social media, in a way, compounding the problem as users generate their own content that they share, being influenced by the partisan media. So when we talk about the media, it's very important to distinguish which media, print versus broadcast, partisan versus objective or aspirationally objective. You did have, of course, in 1974 with Nixon, magazines like the National Review, which were, conservative in their ideology and fairly partisan in defense of the Republican Party. But what's interesting is to look back at the coverage, a lot of those National Review writers who were pretty steadfast in Nixon's corner end up defecting, end up listening to the evidence and saying he lied in very explicit terms. At one point, William F. Buckley, the editor of the magazine, says, at this point, the only reason to resist impeachment is if you don't want to wake up and find yourself in agreement with the New York Times. And so some of these questions were there. The difference is they've now become all-consuming in how people learn the news, which facts are selected, what spin is put on them. My hope during the pandemic was that at a certain point, facts will out, facts will triumph, and that as people saw the death toll from the coronavirus pandemic, they would realize, hey, Trump is not telling us the truth. Hey, these conservative media outlets are not telling us the truth. People are dying.
It's not just the flu.
Right.
It's not going to disappear.
Exactly. I mean, there's a whole list of comments that Trump made and all kinds of people echoing this virus denialism all over the internet. So then when Trump was poised to put out these, completely false claims about having actually won the election, whether in Georgia or in any of these other states, there was such a loss of faith in the mainstream objective media. And when I say objective, I don't mean everyone's perfectly objective, but that they strive to be accurate and faithful to what the facts on the ground tell you.
So it's not like they don't have serious problems of their own. There have been mistakes, but I get your point.
Of course. Right. What we saw in the post-election season, in the election aftermath, in a way we had been primed for through several years of the Trump presidency of people resisting acknowledging the facts are letting their loyalty to Trump or to a movement or to a party override their ability to assess the facts on their own merits.
So, Professor Greenberg, let's close out with your thoughts on something one of my favorite public thinkers, Sam Harris, said last year. He said there's nothing political about correcting false information or criticizing those who knowingly spread it, nor is it partisan to notice that people often believe lies that conform to their own political biases. He said there's a layer of honest thought beyond politics, and it's time we all discovered it together. Well, I don't know. I'm not very optimistic about that.
Yeah, well, look, we could have a half-hour conversation just about sort of the state of media, information environments, partisanship, and so on. I think it's a real confounding problem for the United States and for all democracies today. I mean, you see this going on elsewhere. I think there's a few different reasons for some optimism.
I want to hear them.
Right. I mean, with a grain of salt. One is that facts are stubborn things, as I think John Adams maybe originally said. So with things like the pandemic, at a certain point there can be no denying, what you see with your own eyes. Or maybe not no denying. Some people will deny it. But the power of reality can overwhelm these biases. And at a certain point, for some, the scales do fall from their eyes. The second question is, can a changed political environment improve the polarized media environment? I mean, it's not a one-way vector. These things influence each other. Joe Biden ran for president as sort of the antidote to Trump, as someone who really, I think, very sincerely wanted to be president for everyone and not a terribly partisan president. And it's a big if, Biden can at least go some way toward achieving that unity that he's always talking about, achieving bipartisanship, winning the confidence of even a quarter or a third of diehard Republicans. Not that they have to endorse his every policy, but if he can win their confidence and trust, that can start to build our way back toward, a ground of consensus and agreement where we may disagree on what to make of certain facts, but we're no longer disagreeing about the bare facts themselves.
David Greenberg of Rutgers University, thank you. Soon this impeachment chapter will be over, and who knows when the next American president will face removal from office. Georgia Republican Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene already introduced articles of impeachment against Joe Biden. And to David Greenberg's final point about the need to shove aside fantasies and deal with reality, Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell condemned Greene for subscribing to what McConnell called loony lies. Maybe it's a start. On the next episode of History as It Happens.
Communism, socialism, and fascism, they are all rooted in the same leftist Marxist ideology.
What is socialism? We'll try to get a handle on one of the most slippery words in politics as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.